Africa is not just empty landscapes and stories of poverty we've been seeing on TV for years. It's a continent where the biggest investment offensive of the 21st century is underway. Chinese cranes, trains, and loans are biting into the soil and building things that have never existed here before. Highways, refineries, railways, entire cities. But there are places where these investments matter in a very particular way. Sudan, a country torn apart by wars, but rich in oil and gold, lying on the Nile and the Red Sea. This is where Beijing went looking for a gateway to Arabia and Africa at the same time. Egypt, a state whose very name sounds like a key. The Suez Canal, the artery of global trade, simply cannot be left out of this story. And finally, Tanzania. Less known, quieter, but just as important for strategists in Beijing. Ports on the Indian Ocean, natural gas, new railway lines, everything you need to build the southern wing of the route. And in this part, one more story appears, a story that at first glance seems trivial, but in reality explains everything. The story of shoes. Because in countries where millions of people used to walk barefoot, Chinese factories started producing the cheapest sandals and sneakers made of plastic and cardboard. Shoes that lasted a few weeks, but were so cheap that anyone could buy them. They changed the lives of ordinary people, and at the same time destroyed local craftsmanship, making entire societies dependent on imports from China. These are not details. It's exactly in examples like this that you can see how the Belt and Road Initiative really works. Huge ports and railways for elites and geopoliticians, the cheapest shoes for ordinary people. All of it woven into one system that wraps itself around Africa and the Middle East like a spider's web. So in this episode, we'll move from Sudan through Egypt to Tanzania to see how the Chinese presence is changing the continent and how it's tying it ever more tightly to the Middle East. And at the end, we'll stop at something as simple as a pair of shoes. Because sometimes it's exactly those that tell the story of global politics best. Sudan, a country whose name in Arabic literally means land of the blacks. For centuries, it was a bridge between Africa and the Arab world. Caravan routes carrying gold, ivory, and slaves ran through its lands. This is where the Nile cuts across the desert, creating an oasis of life in the heart of the Sahara. And yet, in recent history, Sudan has mainly been associated with war, poverty, and fragmentation. The civil war that ended with the creation of South Sudan in 2011 left the country ruined and weakened. But even then, it had something that drew the world's attention: natural resources. Sudan means gold and oil. In the 1990s, when the West was imposing sanctions, Beijing reached out. Chinese companies started investing in oil fields, refineries, and later in gold mines. Where Americans and Europeans didn't want to take the risk, the Chinese walked in without hesitation. They built refineries in Khartoum, modernized ports in Sudan, laid roads leading to the mines. But the Chinese presence didn't end with raw materials. Along with engineers and investors came loans that tied Sudan up for years. In practice, that meant Beijing became one of the main sponsors of Omar al-Bashir's regime. Sudanese oil flowed to Asia, while Chinese weapons flowed into Sudan. It was a marriage of convenience in which Beijing didn't ask about human rights or democracy. All that mattered were the contracts. For Sudan, it meant one thing: entering the BRI orbit even before the Belt and Road Initiative officially existed. Because every ship loaded with Sudanese oil or gold sailed through the Red Sea, the same artery China wants to control by investing in Djibouti, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. Sudan was a natural element of that network. But Sudan also means the Nile, the river that gives life to Egypt and has become one of the most explosive flashpoints in the whole region. The construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam in neighboring Ethiopia threatened to reduce water flow to Sudan and Egypt. The Chinese watched this dispute very closely, knowing that whoever controls the waters of the Nile has influence over 500 million people. And although officially they were just technical partners, in practice, their construction firms, banks, and experts played a huge role in the entire game over water. Sudan thus became something more than just another African state. It became a connector between Africa and the Middle East, between gold and oil, between the Nile and the Red Sea. That's exactly why the Chinese invested here with such determination. Because Sudan opens the road to Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Egypt. It's a gateway through which you can enter all of northeastern Africa, Egypt, the land of pharaohs, pyramids, and the Nile, which for thousands of years has been a center of trade and politics in this part of the world. But in contemporary geopolitics, Egypt has one more absolutely key role. This is where the Suez Canal is, the narrow strip of water that links the Red Sea with the Mediterranean, one of the most important economic arteries on the planet. The canal is a marvel of 19th century engineering. Opened in 1869, it shortened the route from Asia to Europe by thousands of kilometers, avoiding the Cape of Good Hope. Today, more than 12% of global trade passes through it. Not only oil and gas from the Persian Gulf, but also containers with electronics from China, textiles from Bangladesh, coffee from Ethiopia. When the Ever Given got stuck in the canal in 2021, the world saw just how dependent it is on that waterway. A few days were enough to start breaking global supply chains. The Chinese understand this perfectly, and that's exactly why Egypt has become one of the most important points in their Belt and Road Initiative. Beijing can't afford to let such a crucial place stay outside its sphere of influence. How do they do it? First and foremost, investments. In 2014, Egypt announced a plan to modernize and expand the canal. A new parallel lane was built, shortening transit times. Chinese companies were among the first to offer support, both technical and financial. Beijing invested in the Suez Canal Economic Zone, a huge industrial area in Ain Sokhna, where factories, warehouses, and logistics centers are popping up. But that's only the beginning. Chinese firms are building power plants in Egypt, financing highways and new cities. The most spectacular project is the construction of Egypt's new administrative capital, a gigantic city in the desert, dozens of kilometers from Cairo. Skyscrapers, ministries, embassies, a financial district. Who's putting up the biggest buildings? Chinese construction conglomerates. In this way, Egypt becomes not just another dot on the BRI map, but the very heart of the whole network. The Suez Canal is the place where all routes converge. Goods from Africa, oil from the Gulf, containers from Asia. Whoever has influence over Egypt has influence over the pulse of the global economy. For Cairo, this is an extremely difficult game. On one side, massive money from Beijing, which rescues the economy and makes mega projects possible. On the other, pressure from Washington, which has treated Egypt as one of its key allies in the region for decades. Egypt cannot turn its back on America, because that's where billions in military and political support come from. But it also can't ignore China, ready to invest billions in infrastructure. That forces Egypt to walk a tightrope like a circus acrobat. By day, it shakes President Xi's hand. At night, it takes calls from Washington. It signs contracts with Beijing for new factories, while at the same time buying American weapons. This balancing act looks very much like Israel's situation, only on a much larger scale. But the Suez Canal is not just big politics. It's also everyday life. On its banks, thousands of Egyptians work in ports, workshops, and offices. For them, the Chinese presence is something very real. New jobs, but also competition, pressure, and the feeling that their country is being sold off in installments. We also can't forget that the Suez Canal is a flashpoint. In 1956, during the Suez Crisis, France, Britain, and Israel tried to take control of the canal after its nationalization. Today, no one sends in tanks, but the struggle for influence continues. Only now, the weapons are loans and contracts instead of bombs. Chinese presence in Egypt also has a symbolic dimension. For Beijing, the Suez Canal is proof that BRI truly wraps itself around the entire globe. Because if goods from Ethiopia, Kenya, or Ghana are to reach Europe, they have to pass through Suez. And if they have to pass through Suez, Beijing wants to be there. Egypt is thus the place where Africa meets the Middle East. This is where trains from Addis Ababa and Nairobi end their route, where gold from Ghana, oil from Sudan, and coffee from Ethiopia are reloaded. It all gathers in one point and then flows on to Europe. It's the bottleneck without which BRI simply doesn't work. That's why the struggle for Egypt will continue, and it will be brutal. The Americans won't give this country up without a fight. The Chinese won't let go because the stakes are too high, and Egypt itself will have to play a double game if it wants to survive in a world where there is no room for neutrality. The Suez Canal is not just a strip of water, it's a vein of the world. And anyone who wants to write the future of the global economy has to have a share in it. Tanzania. A country many people associate with the Serengeti, Kilimanjaro, and the paradise beaches of Zanzibar. But in the shadow of the tourist brochures, there's a story of big politics and big money. Because it's exactly here, on the shores of the Indian Ocean, that China is building the southern wing of the Belt and Road Initiative. Tanzania's biggest city, Dar es Salaam, is one of the largest ports in East Africa. For decades, it has been the main outlet for goods from the interior, coffee from Burundi, copper from Zambia, gold from Malawi. But the infrastructure was outdated, the port was choking in congestion, and the railway looked like a relic from colonial times. And this is where the Chinese stepped in. Beijing has invested billions in modernizing the port and building the new standard gauge railway, which is to connect Dar es Salaam with Tanzania's hinterlands, with Zambia, and even further with the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is not just another railway line, it's a backbone of trade that's supposed to breathe new life into the whole region. Chinese firms are not only laying tracks, they are also financing warehouses, container terminals, industrial zones. In practice, this means that Dar es Salaam is becoming a gateway not only for Tanzania, but for the whole of southeastern Africa. Every container that leaves here will sooner or later end up on ships heading through the Gulf of Aden, the Red Sea, and further, through the Suez Canal to Europe. But Tanzania is more than a port. It also has huge deposits of natural gas and oil. Between 2010 and 2020, some of the largest gas reserves in Africa were discovered here. China immediately showed interest, investing in LNG terminals, gas-fired power plants, and pipelines. Because Tanzanian gas in the future can flow not just to Asia, but also to the Middle East, and from there to Europe. Tanzania also has political significance. For decades, it was a symbol of African socialism, a state ideologically close to Mao's China. Today, it is one of Beijing's key partners in East Africa. The Chinese are not just investing in infrastructure, they are also training thousands of African officials, soldiers, and engineers in Tanzania. For Tanzania, it's an opportunity and a risk at the same time. An opportunity because the country genuinely needs modernization. A risk because its debt is growing. The authorities have to balance between gratitude to Beijing and fear that, in a crisis, it will be China that takes control of its ports or resources. And here we return to the Middle East once again. Dar es Salaam is a port on the Indian Ocean that naturally sends its ships towards the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea. Goods from Tanzania and neighboring countries travel across the same waters patrolled by Chinese warships at Djibouti. Every container from Dar es Salaam is a brick in the global trade structure that flows through Suez and reaches Europe. In practice, this means Tanzania and the Middle East are much more tightly intertwined than it might seem. Oil and gas from Tanzania may in the future be shipped through terminals in the Gulf. Grain from Tanzania may end up in Saudi Arabia, which has been struggling with food security for years, and Tanzanian ports may become a logistical rear base for the entire Chinese presence in the region. But just like in Sudan or Ghana, the true face of Chinese investment is visible not only in ports and refineries, but also in everyday life. Chinese goods have flooded Tanzanian markets. Tanzania therefore shows the full logic of the Belt and Road Initiative. Port plus railway plus resources plus everyday consumption. Big projects for elites and small goods for the masses. All woven into one system with one goal: to turn Africa into the southern wing of Beijing's global network. And that's why Tanzania proves that BRI is not just about the northern part of the continent. Not just about Sudan, Egypt, or Ethiopia. It's also about the South, which is increasingly being pulled into China's orbit. And every ship that leaves Dar es Salaam will, sooner or later, end up in the Middle East anyway. On the map of Africa, there are 3 places that say more about China than all of its glossy investment brochures combined: the South, the Center, and the West. South Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Nigeria. 3 countries, 3 models, 3 different worlds, all tied together with a single thread: the Belt and Road Initiative. Let's start with South Africa. This is not just another African country. It's the only state on the continent that belongs to BRICS, the elite club where Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa sit together. For Beijing, it's a strategic partner. South Africa has a developed economy, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, automotive and mining industries. It also has ports. Durban is the largest container terminal in Africa. The Chinese invest here in factories, mines, and energy infrastructure. They buy stakes in mining conglomerates, finance coal and solar power plants, build roads. But South Africa is more than that. It's a political hub. BRICS summits are held here, where Beijing and Moscow show they have African backing. It's in South Africa that the continent becomes a broker between the global South and the global North. South Africa gives China something other African states don't: legitimacy. Because if the biggest economy in Southern Africa sits in the same club as Beijing, it sends a message that the whole continent is slowly drifting towards China. Now let's move to the heart of the continent, the Democratic Republic of Congo, a huge country, richer in resources than many great powers and at the same time poor and torn by conflict. This is where more than 70% of the world's cobalt reserves are located, a metal absolutely critical in the 21st century. Without cobalt, there are no lithium-ion batteries. Without batteries, there are no electric cars, smartphones, or laptops. In other words, the future of green energy depends on what happens in Congo. Chinese companies have taken over dozens of cobalt and copper mines. They are investing billions in roads, power lines, and infrastructure, but not out of charity. These are investments designed for one thing: to guarantee Beijing control over strategic resources. Western corporations, from Tesla to Apple, are effectively dependent on Congolese cobalt, and a large part of it is mined by companies linked to China. The images from Congo are shocking. Children working in mines, people digging into the earth with their bare hands, sacks of cobalt being carried out on their backs. Next to them, heavy machinery imported from China, modern equipment, Chinese engineers. The contrast says it all. Beijing controls the technology, logistics, and exports, while local communities are left with dust, disease, and a few dollars. For China, Congo is not a partner. It's a warehouse of the future. And for the world, a critical choke point. Because if Beijing has its hand on Congolese cobalt, it has its hand on the throat of the global energy transition. And finally, Nigeria, Africa's largest economy, a country of more than 220 million people, a giant that cannot be ignored. Nigeria means oil, gas, but also a huge consumer market. For China, it's a mass market. Millions of consumers buying cheap phones, clothes, motorcycles, and also Chinese apps and technology. The Chinese build everything in Nigeria, from highways and bridges to railway lines. The Abuja-Kaduna Railway or the Lagos-Ibadan line are examples of projects financed by Beijing. Chinese firms are also constructing power plants, modernizing airports, and entering telecoms. In Lagos, you'll find Chinese shopping centers. In Abuja, Chinese advisors, and in the north, Chinese factories. But Nigeria also means risk. It's a country that is unstable, ethnically and religiously divided, plagued by security problems and corruption. Chinese investments are often exposed to local tensions, and public opinion is more and more frequently asking whether the country isn't becoming a hostage to Chinese loans. For Beijing, however, Nigeria is a prize that cannot be given up. Because if it manages to tie this country in for decades, China will gain not only access to oil and gas, but also a gigantic consumer market. Nigeria can become for China what India is for the West, a young, dynamic society powering economic growth. South Africa, Congo, and Nigeria. 3 countries, 3 models. South Africa, political and diplomatic partner. Congo, warehouse of strategic resources. Nigeria, mass market. Together, they form a picture that tells us one thing. China is playing in Africa on every level. From the tops of politics, through the mines, all the way down to the street markets. All these mega projects, ports, railways, refineries, LNG terminals, sound like something distant, something for presidents and politicians. But the true face of the Belt and Road Initiative is best seen in the smallest of things. Things like shoes. Just a few decades ago, in many parts of Africa, owning your own shoes was a luxury. Millions of people walked barefoot, to school, to work, to the market. Local workshops made sandals from animal hide, sometimes from old tires, but they were expensive and accessible only to a part of society. Then the Chinese arrived. They brought their factories and started mass-producing the cheapest shoes in the world. Out of plastic, rubber, cardboard, synthetic leather, colorful, light, but fragile. They fell apart after a few weeks. They were of such poor quality that they would never pass safety and quality checks in Europe. But in Africa, they became a revolutionary product. For an ordinary person, this meant something very simple. A child could go to school in shoes for the first time. A woman could work at the market without cutting up her feet. A man had something to wear to a wedding or a ceremony. The price was so low that even the poorest could afford them. But there was also a darker side to this story. Local workshops and craftsmen who had been making shoes by hand for generations began to go bankrupt. They had no chance against mass production from China. The African footwear market, previously local, was taken over entirely by Chinese factories. What's more, the same plants that produced cardboard shoes for Africans were simultaneously making quite decent quality sneakers for export, to Europe, to the USA. In big retail chains, you could buy shoes with a Made in Ethiopia or Made in Nigeria label. The European would buy them in a shopping mall. The African, at a kiosk next door, would get a plastic version that would fall apart after a week. And the key piece? Transport. Those shoes, just like gold from Ghana, oil from Sudan, or coffee from Ethiopia, traveled through the Middle East. Containers full of footwear went to ports in Djibouti, Dubai, or Suez. That's where Africa connected with the rest of the world. And here you can finally see the full picture. The Belt and Road Initiative is not only about billion-dollar investments and grand strategies. It's also about the cheapest sandals on a market stall in Dar es Salaam. They determined what hundreds of millions of people wore, and they symbolized a new kind of dependency. Because when millions of people become reliant on imports, even for something as basic as shoes, it means dependence on China becomes total. That's why plastic and cardboard shoes are such an important case study. They show that geopolitics does not end in politicians' offices. It starts on the streets, in markets, on the feet of children walking to school. And every one of those sandals or sneakers, just like oil, gold, and gas, is part of the same network the Chinese are using to wrap Africa and the Middle East. Africa has shown us 2 faces of the Belt and Road Initiative. The big one, in the form of ports, railways, and refineries, and the small one, in the form of plastic sandals that changed the everyday life of millions. But both lead to the same place, the Middle East. Because every container from Dar es Salaam, every barrel of oil from Sudan, every kilogram of gold from Ghana, and every pair of shoes from factories in Ethiopia and Nigeria has to pass through the Red Sea, the Suez Canal, the Gulf of Aden, or the ports of Dubai. That's where Africa connects with Asia. That's where the real artery of 21st century trade begins. The Middle East is not just Africa's neighbor, it's Africa's gateway to the world. But before we move on to detailed stories about Egypt, Saudi Arabia, or the Emirates, it's worth zooming out even further. Because in the analyses coming out of Beijing and Washington, one phrase appears more and more often: the Greater Middle East. It's not just the region from Morocco to Iran. It also includes Afghanistan, Pakistan, and sometimes even Central Asia. A huge belt of land stretching from the Atlantic to the Himalayas. Why is that important? Because for China, America and Europe, this area is simply unavoidable. All routes, maritime and overland, run through it. This is where the biggest oil and gas reserves are. This is where goods and migrants flow. This is where you can see that there is no clear boundary between Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Everything is one system. The Greater Middle East is also a space where every project, from Chinese railways in Pakistan, through economic zones in Morocco, to power plants in Turkey, is part of the same puzzle. There are no small stories here. Every road, every port, every pipeline is a piece of the global rivalry. That's why, when we close the African chapter, we're not really ending anything. On the contrary, we're opening the door to the next act. Because now our story moves to the Middle East in both its classic and extended sense. We'll return to Egypt, step into Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Qatar, and then further, into Iran, Turkey, and even Pakistan. Because if we want to understand how the new Silk Road works, we have to look at the entire region from the Atlantic to the Himalayas. It's exactly there that the battle over the future of trade, resources, and influence is being fought. It's exactly there that the question of who will really write the rules of the 21st century is being decided. Africa was the introduction. The Middle East, that's the heart of the game. And the Greater Middle East, that's the whole board on which the most important match of our times is being played.